Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am your host, Natalie McGruder, representing the Wallace Center at Winrock International. And I want to welcome you to this webinar. The National Good Food Network is hosting it, which is a part of the Wallace Center at Winrock. And this session is on Equitable Food Oriented Development. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Wallace Center and then kick it right over to our first presenter. So the Wallace Center is a unit of Winrock International. It's the host of the National Good Food Network webinars. The Wallace Center has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 30 years. We develop partnerships, pilot new ideas, and advance solutions to strengthen communities through resilient farming and food systems. The National Good Food Network, or NGFN, is an initiative of the Wallace Center that accelerates progress towards the Wallace Center's vision. The NGFN is a connector. We connect peer-to-peer, peer-to-expert, and practitioners to best practices and lessons learned. We do all of this on a national scale so that innovations spread rapidly through the good food world. You can learn a lot more about the great work that we do at the Wallace Center and about NGFN by visiting our website. And for now, let's get into our webinar, and I will introduce Neelam Sharma, who will kick us off for today. So Neelam Sharma serves as Executive Director of Community Services Unlimited, a nonprofit based in South Central Los Angeles. Community Services Unlimited is committed to supporting and creating justice-driven, community-based programs and educational initiatives which seek to foster dialogue and create awareness and critical consciousness. As a result of her experience and success working and organizing with residents to expand urban agriculture, build models for grassroots economic development, and improve community health, Neelam is recognized as a national leader on the intersection between community economic development, youth empowerment, and food justice. So we will now welcome Neelam. She'll turn on her camera and her mic, and we will learn from her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the Wallace Center for organizing this webinar. So I wanted to spend a few minutes just to start out by talking about how we came together. Where did this thing called EFOD, come from? And so there have been a number of us, as I'm sure many of you out there who are in communities doing the work that we do on a daily basis. And so there were many of us, myself and other folks who I consider my colleagues, mentors, partners around the country who have been in communication and conversation, as we do, supporting each other and discussing things and, talking about the good stuff, the bad stuff, the challenges. And really for us, and you see here in the slide, this is a photo from many years ago with an incredibly young-looking Dana Harvey. And I wanted to reference Dana. For those of you who don't know, Dana was the founder and executive director for many years of Mandela Partners. And she's one of the people who was absolutely instrumental in bringing together folks that ultimately kind of became this EFOD Collaborative. So we were in conversation and we were really very frustrated, many of us, that about a number of things. One of them being that there's a certain way that those of us who are really deeply embedded in community kind of work. There's a way in which what we do, I mean, I've had people say to me, like, what do you do? Do you do school gardens? Do you do farmers markets? Like, what do you actually do, right? Because we do a lot of different things. And that's something that some folks have a hard time getting their heads around. But really, if you look at really grassroots agencies, we do have a very holistic approach because we are deeply embedded in communities. So one thing was the difficulty in getting folks to funders and other folks who support this work to see the very holistic nature of our work. Another was that we were incredibly frustrated with the kind of lack of historical context for the work that many of us do. And so, you see up on your screens right now, There's a slide with a quote from Malcolm X. It's armed with the knowledge of our past, we can with confidence charter a course for our future. Culture is an indispensable weapon in the freedom struggle. We must take hold of it and forge the future with the past. So for us, we were very frustrated that there was no real context for many of the food projects that we were seeing happening. And therefore, some of those projects, especially with the field of practice having been built and more funds having been allocated to it, that many of those projects were kind of come today, gone tomorrow projects without really a lot of thought being put into, well, when that money goes away, what happens? What really is being built here in terms of long-term sustainability and some kind of lasting presence of this work in this community? One of the things that we had begun to do was to really talk amongst ourselves about what are those things. And many of you may be familiar with the term Sankofa, which in the Twi language in Africa means literally to reach back and look at the past in order to give ourselves context for our present and understand why we're faced with the situation we're faced with now, so that we can actually map out some kind of pathway to the future, right? So that's simply what Sankofa means. And so many of us had really begun to connect and had always, in fact, connected what we do now to historical context, right? So you see a photo of my colleague and friend Malik here from Detroit, and the other photo you see is actually a timeline, part of a timeline exhibit of CSU's own history and our connections to our founders. So these were some of the concerns, and then the final, the major concern that was bothering us was that, you know, in addition to these two things, was that even the methodology that exists, that's mainstream for measuring success of the work that we do, you know, what we all know is evaluation, right? That even those methodologies were not really speaking to the work that many of us were doing, you know. And really, I think about like the debate from maybe 50 years ago around testing in schools, right? That, you know, why is it that certain people do better in tests and others don't? Well, because the tests were actually written, you know, referencing a certain community, right? And that's why certain communities were successful in them. And similarly, you know, we felt very strongly that the mainstream evaluative methods being used for projects that were emerging in the field justice field of practice, in the food justice field of practice, were evaluative methods that didn't really speak to the work that we were doing. So these were some of the concerns that brought us together. And so we came together initially just through different conversations that different ones were having with different folks around the country. There are many people, too many to mention. Many of us are on the call now. There are many others, you know, out there doing the work. But so first of all, it was individual conversations, group conversations when we would be together at events and conferences. And then actually Dana, who I referenced earlier, you know, she really decided that, look, we really have to do something on this. And she was really the push for that. And she kind of brought together a group of us in Oakland in around 2015, towards the end of 2015, if I remember correctly. And so we came together and we began to kind of really brainstorm some of these ideas. And that very initial, very rough, very draft work is what led to more of us coming together, ultimately, you know, bringing together a bigger cohort. It led to the partnership with DAISA, which and others who've been involved in building this work, and has led to our current working definition. I'll just read it out real quick. EFOD is a development strategy that uses food and agriculture to create economic opportunities, healthy neighborhoods, and explicitly seeks to build community assets, pride and power by and with historically marginalized communities. So the core questions that occupied us as we began to come together as a bigger cohort is how is EFOD distinguished from other forms of food-oriented development. And I'll just give you one example. Many years ago, when we were kind of doing this work and beginning to think about how could we leverage the urban farming and the other very food-oriented projects that we were doing, how could we leverage those to build economic growth in our neighborhood? And I remember going to a conference that, a statewide California conference that is all about building community economic development. And, they were talking about food-oriented development, and they were talking about things like bringing Ralph's into neighborhoods, bringing Starbucks into neighborhoods, those kinds of things. And I think that the way that we really distinguish ourselves is that, one, that we're really about grassroots. It's not about bringing in corporations. It's not about bringing in big players from elsewhere. It's really about how do you build the skills and the talents that already exist in our communities and are manifold. How do you build those to build really long-lasting, sustainable projects where once the initial investment or the tax dollars, the tax write-offs that the corporations get go away, they're also going to go away, which has been the practice, right? How do we actually sort of do that? The second major concern was, does EFOD lend itself to impacts different from those of conventional food systems projects? And yes, it does. And that's one of our major concerns, is how do we measure those? So one of them I'd referenced in talking about, building pride, building long-term assets in communities. Does EFOD require unique forms of support and investment? And that's going to be talked about by somebody else shortly. So now I'm incredibly happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Mariela Cedeno, who is an incredible numbers person who has been working with Mandela Partners for like 10 years now, I believe. And really took on, when she came in, the task of building Mandela Partners work with small businesses and really economically how to build small businesses as a very integral part of the work that Mandela Partners does. In addition to all those things that she's doing, she's also currently functioning as the interim executive director. So I'm handing it over to Mariela.
Thanks, Neelam. Hi, everybody. Neelam said my name is Mariela Cedeno. Just picking up where Neelam stepped off. So, part of our work has been really trying to figure out how we understand the context of EFOD different from traditional food-oriented development. So some of the things that I want to share with you all are the themes that have come up in this very now 4-year process that we've been engaged in to understand EFOD better. So the first thing that I'll start off with is that at the center of EFOD organizations is equity and justice first. So it's something that is part of our mission, and that we are very unapologetic in representing historically marginalized communities and the communities that we work with and serve and are part of every day. So something that, when we're thinking through what does it look like to be a food-oriented development project versus an equitable food-oriented development project, that's at the center of that. So, some of the context that I'll share also is that when we think of our work as EFOD organizations, we're really thinking about sustainability and the depth that the work can build and serve communities that we're part of. So, not to say that food-oriented development organizations aren't doing good work, but when we think about sustainable long-term systemic change, EFOD framework is required. So equity and justice first, equity-centered, a commitment to including larger transformational work, advocacy, policy work. And then, like Neelam mentioned, a lot of us do have food as a center tenet of our work, but we're looking at a much broader, holistic picture of what that looks like. The second piece, which is intrinsic in this, is that our work is place-based. So, we are deeply connected to community. We're thinking about culture and pride, the history that drives our work, and how we build leadership within our own communities. So when you look at traditional food-oriented development organizations, typically what you'll find is work that's centered around food, but maybe isn't as connected to community, doesn't include community as a leading voice, is not centered on that. And that at some points may not be typically connected to a specific neighborhood or a specific community that is being served. The third piece, which I found really interesting as we've really delved into building the EFOD Collaborative, is that all of us are acknowledging that economy is a big part of our work. And so in that, we're also looking at developing new markets and enterprises that create real economic opportunities for the communities that we work within. And also that we're looking at sustainable change. So like Neelam mentioned, yes, one way that you might be able to address food access is to try to entice a Kroger to come in, but no, that isn't an EFOD type project because it doesn't really involve community, right? We're not building the assets, we're not creating wealth, we're not thinking about power and pride building when it's an outside project. And again, because of the holistic nature of our work, we have a lot of things that we're bringing in. So we're not just thinking about education in a silo or policy in a silo or awareness building in a silo or a garden project or a farmer's market project like Neelam mentioned. We have a site for a holistic perspective of what it takes to really create thriving neighborhoods. The next piece of this is community leadership. So, you know, we're not just looking at coming in and building something within a neighborhood. We're really looking at power building. So, you know, our boards look like the communities that we represent. The work is led by community members within our communities. And we're also looking at how do we convene other stakeholders to really build that asset and that power base within neighborhoods. And then the last piece that I'll share also that Neelam alluded to is that, you know, typically when we look sort of conventional strategies for food-oriented development often have an over-reliance on outside capital. We're looking at businesses that don't have investment in neighborhoods. And then also that when we look at those sort of metrics, people think of, you know, sales or jobs created. When you're looking at EFOD organizations, part of that criteria that makes you part of this work is that you're building community member assets. We have, again, a strong equity lens. We're thinking about decision-making as a core center principle of the work that we're thinking through, and then ownership and local wealth building. So this isn't just about job creation, it's about really who's owning the economies of the neighborhoods that we're looking to build up. So just to share a project that Mandela Partners has been part of that you know, shows what these EFOD criteria look like in practice. In March of this year, we joined community to open the Ashland Market and Cafe. This project came out of a very long community development process that included a community advisory committee. It included neighborhood stakeholders. It included folks who live in the building that we opened, which is an affordable housing complex. And once it was open, once that vision of what it was going to be, once it opened, the folks who were building wealth and owning it were also folks from the neighborhood. So here you'll see 4 of the businesses that launched in the Ashland Market and Cafe. These are folks, Andrea, who's all the way on the left, she actually lives in Ashland Apartments. Jacqueline, who's about to cut or just cut the ribbon, she lives in the affordable housing unit next door. And LaShawn and Renee, who you see here on the right, are folks who live in the unincorporated parts of Alameda County. You know, for us, it was really important when we were invited into the community. You know, we've been doing work for a long time in Ashland, but we were invited to be part of this project, was that we weren't just thinking through, like, what does Mandela think should be here, but really being thoughtful about what does the community want here. And part of that meant that we engaged in over a year-long process to figure that piece out. And what we were finding over and over again is that people, you know, and part of that theme of wanting access to healthy food and wealth building opportunities, that a lot of people were making things at home, selling it to friends and family. They were maybe like hustling in other cities to sell things out of their car, doing informal pop-ups at churches, at other community events. And the opportunity and the barrier that they were facing was access to space. So this came up as both a way to build a accessible space for local entrepreneurs to showcase their products, to build their own wealth, to be agents in job creation, and also to meet community needs. So folks wanted culturally relevant food, they wanted things that were priced at a correct price point, and to know that they were celebrating community entrepreneurs. So we'll talk more about what this looks like in practice, but I wanted to share something that recently came up as a project led by Mandela. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to introduce you to Lorena Andrade. Lorena is the director of La Mujer Berretta, which is a local independent organization located in El Paso, Texas, dedicated to creating communities defined by women. I'll let Lorena share more about herself, but Lorena's amazing. She is an incredible community leader and has been at the center of this EFOD framework that we are looking to build. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, my name is Lorena Andrade. I am with La Mujer Berretta. We're a garment worker organization located in El Paso, Texas. So we're right along the Mexican border. And so our organization has always been has existed here in the garment, what they used to call the garment industry. And we've always had this argument with the city about, should this community serve the needs of the factories and industry, or should it serve the needs of our families? And so that's what, and also as women workers here along the border, we always have fought to have a space to think and plan and implement our ideas and our vision for our community. But with the North American Free Trade Agreement that passed in 1994, we lost about 35,000 jobs. The majority of the people who lost their jobs were women. And since then, we've also began to do a lot of, fight against the effects of NAFTA, but also we've started certain social enterprises like a restaurant, a daycare center. We have a network of indigenous women's cooperatives in Mexico, and like an import company. So for us, it's always like, what is our proposal? If we have a daycare center, then the daycare center is also about to question, what is our relationship with our children? How do we create a better educational opportunities for our children? Everything, all the businesses that we have are with the intention of us having a practice, a collective practice, so that we can figure things out, learn about our ancestral foods, learn about education, but also what is our proposal for education in the neighborhood. Another thing that we've been dealing with here on the border has been maintaining community and defending our community. So we've had to balance two parts to our community. One of them is kind of, like I say, always holding them off. Because since there's no more garment factories in our community, and the garments and the factories are on the other side of the border, then many of the things that they've wanted to push out our residents. And so we've really felt they've wanted to knock down our housing units, for example, shut down our elementary schools. The effects of NAFTA have also been the diesel contamination, because there's an international bridge right in our community. For example, the metal recycling trash that is being imported from Ciudad Juarez and being recycled behind one of our elementary schools is another one. So we have Familias Unidas, which is fighting against these negative impacts of NAFTA, but then also, and the school shutdowns, for example. But then we have the other part that we've also been talking about, which is, what is our proposal? And NAFTA and the factory and the garment industry, a lot of what it did was that when it asks women, what is it that a lot of us always saying, well, I don't know anything. That's basically one of those things. But we know, as in Mujer Berretta, that as we talk about food and we talk about growing food, all of a sudden we have like this over kind of flowing amount of information, and the conversation, we have a lot of knowledge. So it's, how do we reclaim the knowledge that is in our community? How do we find out what we know? So, who's growing food? Like the pictures that you're seeing right now is about some of the women in the community growing their own food, whether it's in a little piece between the concrete and a fence, in your front yard, the fruit trees. All of those things are really important for us to be able to document, so that the residents themselves can see how much there really is, to create a sense of community and of pride. And then we'll hold like festivals, for example, and we'll hold, we call them tianguis, which are kind of like a farmer's market, but they're more than that, is a festival, like a celebration of our community. So every single workshop that is done about health, about nutrition, about our ancestral foods, about growing food, all of that is done by the residents or the women themselves. And many times the women are like, oh, I didn't know we were so smart. I didn't know we had so much information. And I think for us, that's the really important part, that there begins to be a pride in place, a pride in community, that we have something to defend. And so we try to always balance those two things out, the defending the community, against the hurting of the Mother Earth or hurting the environmental racism, but then what is our proposal to heal our relationship with the earth? What is our proposal to heal the relationships with each other? And it all is always centered around food, music, art, and that celebration. And so we try to really balance those two things out. And then in the two pictures that you're seeing here is of the Familias Unidas, about the recycling facility, defending our public schools. And so in the economic projects that we have, the real question is, like, if we're working in the restaurant to talk about food, for example, or if it's education in the daycare center, what is it that we're learning as women in the implementation of that education, of learning from the children and healing those relationships with our children? And then how does that inform what we're fighting for out in the community for the improvement or the betterment of the education in our neighborhood? It's not only enough to say we want better education, but we have to have that proposal. And so our economic practice informs our organizing, and then our organizing also informs how we develop our businesses. And so those two things always have to be constantly flowing in our organization. So that's a little bit about what we do in La Mujer Berretta. And because of that work and because of DAISA knowing us, we were integrated into this EFOD group, and we've been learning a lot from them, and hopefully we've been able to also contribute that. So we've been participating in that for about a year, I think. And now I'd like to pass la palabra to Trisha Chocobarti, who has been working with the EFOD group as a representative of DAISA Enterprises, and she's helped us along this road. So, Trisha.
Thanks, Lorena. And I just want to say I'm so glad to be here with you all, and thanks to the Wallace Center for hosting us today. As of today, we have this white paper that is released on the EFOD.org website. And so you all can read that and look through that. And, this is still very much a work in progress. And so keep that in mind as you're reading the white paper. We are still learning from many organizations that are doing this work, as well as allies and supporters in the field as well. Let's see. There we go. So as has been mentioned, I am working with the EFOD Collaborative as a representative of DAISA Enterprises. And DAISA is a strategy consulting firm. All of our staff have a breadth of experience in community-based food systems. And DAISA was invited by the EFOD Collaborative at the start of last year to support in research and consensus designed recommendations for support of EFOD. We have been facilitating the EFOD Collaborative, and you can see a picture of our first practitioner gathering as a formal EFOD Collaborative in April of last year. Of course, as Neelam, Mariela, and Lorena have mentioned, this work has been going on for much longer than the formal group. And we are, with DAISA, we're really happy to be able to formalize some of what we've been learning and to help create this body of knowledge. Let's see. Great. So I will start talking about our field scan that we conducted, led by metrics and the criteria that Mariela mentioned. We looked at a variety of food system networks and funding communities, looking at a total of 816 organizations. Based on application of that criteria, we narrowed down our first round of EFOD aligned organizations to 88. And you can find that first round list at EFOD.org. We also conducted interviews with a variety of practitioners, both rural and urban, as well as various stakeholders in allied fields. We have had a variety of gatherings of EFOD practitioners and supporters as we continue to workshop the EFOD definition and learn from stakeholders. So most recently, we hosted a dinner at the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders meeting, earlier this year. And then, of course, in the background, DAISA, myself and my colleagues have been conducting a lit review to make sure that we're uplifting an evidence base for the EFOD work as well. Great. Okay, so I also want to talk about some of the outcomes of this research and input gathering. And some of this you'll be able to read in the white paper as well. And we are still gathering more information about practitioner designed impacts and metrics that will accurately describe EFOD work. But I have a few here that really point to the differences of using an EFOD framework versus a non-equitable food-oriented development framework. As you heard in the examples shared by each of the three fellows, we know that EFOD organizations preserve a community's need for control over its own economic, political, social, or health-related future. Ownership or control of space as one particular impact is very important in threatened communities, and EFOD organizations are committed to developing projects that allow for that control and the creation of assets in communities through the control of that space. EFOD organizations further reflect their communities' oftentimes disconnection from local decision making, but they are often involved in resisting oppressive policies and creating new political relationships and generating new models of development that highlight the existing skills, knowledge, and assets of their communities. And you heard Lorena talk about some of the really impressive examples of that work happening in El Paso. Of course, across the country, we know that we can all conjure up examples of non-equitable food-oriented development initiatives, like bringing in chain grocery stores, like urban gardening programs that may in fact lead to increased property values or displacement or the draining of resources from these communities. And we are really certain that EFOD is an approach to food systems development that can prevent some of these unintended impacts. So I want to talk about some of the available resources. As part of the collaborative, we wanted to create a public-facing site where you can find, as I mentioned, this mysterious white paper that is now available today, as well as some case studies, the criteria that Mariela mentioned, and we'll be continuously adding to this website, www.ephod.org, to really meet these three goals of demonstrating the unique value of EFOD work, offering those consensus-defined recommendations for support of EFOD work, and then really also creating a call to action. We are all involved in food systems work, and there is an onus on all of us to make sure that our field is really doing all that it can to create equitable outcomes within marginalized communities. So I really encourage you all to check out the EFOD website, read the paper, give us your feedback and input, get involved with us as we continue to grow and define the impact of EFOD. And I can also share a little bit about what our next steps for the field are. So over the past year and a half, we've been conducting this research and putting together the white paper. We will continue to use practitioner thought leadership and a really rigorous impact analysis to, as I mentioned earlier, really define further those differential impacts of EFOD-based work and come together to create metrics that will both reflect those impacts and also reflect the experiences of practitioners, so that what we're describing as a collaborative is reflective of the experience of practitioners and communities on the ground. What we're hoping to do in the future is to really create some of that supportive financing infrastructure. Of course, the biggest challenge that we heard over and over again in our research when interviewing and talking to practitioners was some of the difficulties in financing these large-scale projects. You know, these are communities that are, that while they have enormous amounts of assets, are often financially strapped. And we are trying to figure out what a pilot system might look like to change some of the relationships between practitioners, funders, and conventional food systems investors to create more of a supportive environment for EFOD work. And to get more into the nitty-gritty of some of those recommendations, I'll pass the mic back to Mariela, who will be able to share more.
Hey, everybody. Just running a little bit behind on time, so I'll skip some of the quotes. But I guess I want to share the three groups that we are really hoping to bring together as a call of action. So the first is a field of supporters, and who we see as that are, like Trisha mentioned, funders, impact investors, CDFIs, really folks who understand the mission and the vision and the criteria of EFOD. The second group that we see as part of this are field builders. So those are folks like the Wallace Center or other places that can help us get the word out about EFOD. And the third, obviously, is practitioners. Practitioners are at the core of this work. We have been building this very purposefully to represent our voice and to ensure that whatever comes out of this is representative of our work. So to share a few of the high-level recommendations that have come as we've engaged in this process, specifically geared towards field supporters, the first thing is really that we have to have a reality check about the things that we have to confront and change. And those are institutional practices that often deepen marginalization. So for us, where this really comes up the most, or the conversations we've been investing in the most have been around lending and needing to restructure underwriting practices, pipeline development, the many things that are involved that are, one, often based on structurally racist systems, and two, that can be changed to ensure that EFOD organizations get the right type of financing. The second, which again should be is implicit in our work, is to ensure that we involve community-based practitioners in decision making. So when we think about resources, how do we involve those folks in making decisions around how those resources are shared? The third also is, again, we're trying to bring together many different stakeholders with the hopes that we can develop a collaborative funding mechanism that employs multiple vehicles. So the way we've been thinking about this more recently is that we're deploying soft money that's philanthropic that really helps build capacity of organizations, so pre-development grants. And then once folks are really ready to get the kind of investment that can catalyze or sort of launch these projects, then we're looking at things like guarantee pools and credit enhancement dollars, loan loss reserves, equity pools, all the ways that we can ensure that, one, funds that are available are leveraged, and two, that funds that are available are reaching EFOD practitioners. The other two pieces that I'll also share that are really important to us as we think about how we bring together philanthropy and investment is that all of this pipeline is embedded with capacity building. So understanding that we have a great well of assets in our neighborhoods, that part of making sure that those neighborhoods are invested in and those assets are leveraged is that we understand how to do that and that we start incorporating some of those capacity building mechanisms into the ways that we can invest. And then the last piece that's come up in this that I really want to overemphasize is, obviously we've talked to you a bit around market-based strategies that EFOD organizations, practitioners, folks who are part of this collaborative are engaging in. But just as important in all of this for us is to ensure that while we're investing in market-based mechanisms, that we're also really mindfully investing in the needed capital that we need in order to make sure that we at the core are continuing to invest in community building work. So really that for us is grant funding, so philanthropic funding that allows us to create a vision of thriving communities that reflect the neighborhood needs, that reflect how we can leverage neighborhood opportunities, and more importantly, that allow us to do the kind of organizing and community building that we need in order to leverage assets. And Neelam, I'll pass on to you for what we're asking of practitioners.
Thank you, Mariela. Yeah, so, you know, as we've said several times already, this is very much a practitioner defined, built and led collaborative, which is actually quite unique in this field of practice. So, you know, we are looking for folks to get involved so that we can really develop a form of evaluation, a form of measurement of the work that we do that actually speaks to the work that we do. You know, we want to develop a system of creating some kind of measurement that kind of works across many different communities, doing work in maybe different ways, but with the same underlying values of EFOD organizations. So, you know, and I also wanted to speak briefly to, you know, for other folks out there, you know, so it's not just funders and financiers or practitioners, but there's other ways that we can be supported that aren't necessarily about hard cash. So for example, you know, this webinar today is a huge support from the Wallace Center, kind of making this happen to get the word out about EFOD. The creation of the EFOD Fellowship itself is, you know, which really was created by the Wallace Center to do exactly what we need, which is to support the work that we're already doing, because as those of you out there know, we're all doing so much, right? And there's also ways that folks can help with their expertise. So as we do start to do some of the things that Mariela was referencing, we're going to need not just you know, not just funding, but also people's expertise in the various fields to make that happen. So, so please check out the website, help us get the word out on the white paper, maybe link it to your website, to your, send it out on your listservs, and get some buzz happening around this this new field of practice, so that we can build it as practitioners. Yeah. And I think I'm handing it back over to Natalie.
Yes, thank you, Neelam. So I want to tell you a little bit about our engagement with this fellowship. And the Wallace Center started in 2018 the Regional Food Economies Fellowship with some support from the Kresge Foundation. And that initial cohort was 8 practitioners, and they were able to bring some really unique approaches to supporting the investment in regional food economies. And this cohort, which you now know is the EFOD cohort, is definitely something that we have been invited into. It's not something that we've created. It's something that we're very honored to be a part of. And so just wanting to acknowledge that even though this is the Wallace Center's EFOD Fellows program, it's a continuation of our Regional Food Economies program, that we really have been invited to this space to contribute in the ways that we are best suited to do so. And we're very thankful for DAISA and for the fellows to allow us to have that support of the work. So the EFOD Fellowship is these lovely ladies that you've heard from today. We have funding from the Novo Foundation for this second cohort, and the fellowship includes 12 months of financial and technical support to help the fellows as they develop, define, and share this area of practice. So the objectives of the fellowship is to deepen the existing efforts that you've heard them talk about today, to raise the profile of EFOD with new stakeholder groups, and as Neelam said, we would ask that all of you contribute to raising that profile as well, now that you've heard something about it. You'll also see in the comments box, there is the press release which talks more about this fellowship. And we also want to make sure that folks can have new tools that they can utilize. So that's one of the things that the fellows will be coming up with to help other food systems practitioners apply the best practices and to engage new audiences, and then participating in a community of practice. So that can be face-to-face convenings, it can be digitally like we're doing on this webinar. So essentially all that the Wallace Center is adding to this is the support of what these fellows are already doing, and with DAISA. So I want to make sure that we have time for your questions. As I mentioned before, there is a questions box, and you can direct a question to one particular panelist, or you can ask that question and have everyone reply. So I'm just going to look in the box and see what questions we might have so far, and if I can ask for Mariela and Neelam and Lorena to unmute their mics to be ready to reply and also share their faces with us. So, question number one, let's see here, what should we go with? So I answered this in the chat, but people wanted to know, will they be able to see this later? And yes, the webinar link will be sent out to you for the replay, and you will be able to watch this and share it with all of your friends, along with the EFOD white paper and the press release. So one question is, how does an organization join the collaboration? Anyone want to take that question on?
Yeah, I would just say shoot us an email and we'll add you to the conversation. We're hoping, as Trisha mentioned, last year, I think was our first formal convening. So, Neelam shared the history of all the informal convenings that have been happening to make this happen. But as of this year, we're more formally the EFOD Collaborative. So, just shoot us, any of us, an email and we'll get you connected and engaged.
Great. And so you can see each individual's email on the screen here, so feel free to do that. Next question. Could a list of collaborative funding strategies be shared with us? I couldn't catch all the great examples that were shared in this webinar. Is that something maybe they can look forward to in the white paper, or what do you guys suggest for that?
Sorry, I don't mean to be monopolizing this, but Neil and Lorena, feel free to step in. So the white paper will have, and sorry, we would just want to make sure that we had time for questions. The white paper will have a longer description of those recommendations for field supporters and builders and practitioners. Just to share that, we spent this past year and a half really engaging around what the criteria are, what is equitable food oriented development to us as practitioners. And like Trisha mentioned, there are some things that are coming. So we're looking to deepen our understanding of what we're going to need more specifically around investment, and then as well as starting to build those metrics that Neelam talked about that represent EFOD groups. So yes, so the white paper, read the white paper, that's a start, and then we'll be sharing more as more is developed.
Thank you.
I will only just add that in terms of financing, there are 2 very detailed case studies on the website as well. So check those out. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. What role do you see for charitable food sector, such as food pantries, in EFOD?
I would recommend folks read the book Big Hunger, because, while there is definitely and has been and is and will be a place for that kind of work, and we support it and it's important. Ultimately, it's kind of the difference between, to use a biblical reference, it's the difference between giving people pieces of fish and teaching folks how to fish, right? What we're interested in doing, it's not to put down anything anyone else is doing, but what we're interested in doing is to build the resilience in our communities for folks to build businesses, to keep dollars local, to attract investment, to, all the things that we know that we can do if we can get that investment, right? We know we can do it. And so that's what we're more interested in, is building that sustainability and that long-term viability of our communities.
Thank you. What role, if any, do you think non-people of color could play in EFOD organization or EFOD work?
Shall I just take that? I think there's many non-people of color playing a role. I mean, the fact that we're kind of where we are right now, we're beginning to have this conversation around building a financial strategy. So, and we are looking to work with people of every color in terms of their expertise, right? So this field of practice is practitioner-led and practitioner-built and defined, and will continue to be. But you know, there's a role for everybody within it. So as, for example, we have met folks, I mean, just in the case studies that you see on our website, you know, some of the models for what we consider EFOD projects have been built by all kinds of collaborations that include non-people of color. So this is not about excluding anyone, but this is about saying that the work that we are all doing is in communities of color and is led and defined by those communities.
Thank you. So this is a good one. In your experiences in the community, has it been possible to solve the root causes while taking an economic development approach? Meaning, can we solve the problem by taking a market approach? What other avenues of action do you recommend?
Revolution. I mean, somebody else should speak. And I'll just say very briefly, look, we know we're working within a system that doesn't work. The food system is broken. The economic system we're in does not exist to serve the communities that we serve, right? And what we're doing is we're simply trying to work with what's here, with each other, to create the best that we can within the scenario that we're in. Is it the ultimate answer to everything? No, of course it's not. You know, but we're doing what we can within the economic system that we're within, while creating models for something very, very different that we want to see.
Lorena, you have any thoughts? I want to give you the word before I step in.
Okay, well, for us, it's true. I mean, we're living in this context. And so how do we, when we make economic projects, when we're organizing out in the community, when we defend space, when we defend community, that's kind of taking a little piece. And for us, the reto, the challenge is, how are we creative in that, right? As factory workers, 12 hours of our day were completely controlled. So when we can liberate some of that space to use our minds and our creativity and our labor to collectively try at least to construct an alternative, I think that's a big deal. And so that's why the organizing and the economic work for us has to be combined. You can't do it separate. If not, we're just repeating the same thing. And that's why building on the knowledge that is already in our community has to be at that base. The respect for human beings and the respect for nature, Mother Earth, that has to be the base of how we build and construct. And then automatically that's gonna allow us that creativity, and we're automatically gonna hopefully create something different. And that's why we're always fighting against the forces of gentrification and others, because at the base of industrialization is the destruction of community, the destroying of the social fabric of our people and of the earth. And so when we say women are at the forefront of creating that community, that goes right against that. And so that's why we find ourselves in such difficult situations, especially in the economics and the paying the bills and the maintaining of a building, that everyday kind of work that is hidden, you know, is if we let it, if we don't do the organizing, if we're not thinking of an alternative, then the economic pressures could really move you away from that ultimate goal of defending community. And so that's just kind of the everyday hidden work of this type of work of creating community, of sustaining economic projects. So there's more questions and answers, because if we don't work collectively, we're never going to get to those answers, right? That's what's going to get us our process and our practice, and the difference is going to allow us to see a better community.
That's right.
Word. Yep. Not adding anything to that. Y'all are dope.
Word. Next question. What do you think are some ways for local government to most effectively engage with the EFOD framework?
Neelam, I feel like you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways, you know. There are so many things that local government could do to make what we do not so difficult. I mean, you know, there are so many rules and regulations, right, that most of which exist for very good reasons. So, for example, you know, we just opened the Paul Robeson Center just over a year ago, last August, right? And here we are, a small, very, very timidly staffed nonprofit trying to do this. And we're up against the same rules and regulations that multinational corporations are under, right? Who are seeking to develop places to make millions of dollars to make individuals rich. And we're doing this work for community benefit, and yet we're having to go through the same bureaucracy, right? So there has to be a way that local government can work with us. Like, I'm not saying make stringencies around the sort of health permitting of kitchens and stuff any easier for us. That's not what I'm saying. But the bureaucratic measures that exist, they're so incredibly, there's such incredible barriers, you know, having to get through those is so difficult for small agencies like us. So there must be a way that local government can set up some kind of office or staff person or someone who works specifically to make the work that people like us do not so difficult.
Yeah, I'll just building on that. I think one of the core things that I would invite local government to think about is really how they think about the asset base of communities, right? So I think often when I think of the context of development, there's two things that come up for me. One is that there's usually a deficit framework that's talked about, right? So it's just like, oh, folks are poor, they don't have this, they don't have that. How do we get it to them? Without acknowledgement around the asset base that exists, right? Like the fact that folks are hustling harder than anywhere else, the fact that folks have done so much with so little. So I think one is just a framework shift, right? It's like really inviting government to think about the asset building capacity in neighborhoods. And I think the other piece too is thinking about then how do you build those things, right? How do you build power? How do you build wealth? How do you build those things in a way that is representative of neighborhoods? So I'll give you the context of Oakland just to call it fully out. You know, often when I see specific plans of neighborhoods, those, you know, like I'll give you a small example. You know, West Oakland is part of that bigger strategy or the bigger historic vision of like the Harlem of the West, right? And I remember the first time I saw one of the specific plans specifically for West Oakland, they had like a jazz club. And I asked about what exactly that was. And they were like, oh, there's this great restaurateur in Chicago that could bring a jazz club to West Oakland. And that was just so absurd to me, right? That you're like in part of the seed of that sort of musical renaissance of the West Coast. And that as a city, you were thinking about how do we go to Chicago to find that? And that's like a microcosm. So I think that to me is a shift in framework about how cities think about residents and asset building. And then, yeah, just to echo it, is just finding ways to better involve grassroots efforts, not undervaluing those efforts and not undervaluing community as from a policy perspective, right? Like, we have so much wealth, so much power, so much knowledge, and so much history that not going to residents and not going to community first just doesn't make sense.
Thank you. And we had a follow-up comment, and someone said local government could provide resources to implement policies to make them a reality, not just nice words. So definitely. Next question. What do you see as the role of conventional or production agriculture in a more community-based food system? How can conventional farmers and producers also be helpful or involved in a growing community-based and urban farming space?
Lorena, did you want to say something about that? No. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's a big question, right? And I think that question goes to the comment I made earlier that part of the reason we're doing the work that we do, and so many of us around this country and the world are having to do the work that we do, is because the food system is broken. And the food system is broken because of the way that mainstream conventional farming is done, because of the way that food is distributed, because of the way that it's disposed of, because of, you know, the whole way that our food system is currently organized. And so that's going to you know, if we really are going to look as a human race to have an occupiable planet, one of the things that we're going to have to figure out is how we run our food system, right? Because one of the biggest contributors to global climate change and the destruction of our environment is the way that we grow, harvest, distribute, and deal with food waste, right? So you know, I don't think there's any kind of getting around it. That's all going to have to shift. Now, you know, in the long term. Now, if we're talking about short-term partnerships and other things, I'm not saying that any of that can't happen, but if you're asking that as a big long-term question, it's going to have to change, for not just for our work, honestly, but for humanity's existence. It's going to have to change.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question and then give each of you maybe just a minute to sum up and say anything that you'd like people to kind of leave with before I do our outro. So our last question, what are the ways that other philanthropic partners can get engaged in this work? And I guess maybe as a follow-up, there's another question that's a little bit related. What can lending organizations do to promote real economic development in traditionally underinvested communities where additional debt is not what communities need? So one part of that you could choose to answer is the philanthropic partners, and the other half, what can lending organizations do to make things better, not worse?
I guess I'll kick things off. You know, for funders specifically, like, we're inviting you to be part of this collaborative. I think, you know, we have a few goals that were mentioned, and one of these eventual goals will most likely to create a collaborative fund that is democratically owned and operated by practitioners, and that will require philanthropy to deploy funds into that work. And so I think one way that folks can get involved is to help us think through what that could look like. To invite other philanthropists in their spaces into this conversation, and to start, you know, honestly, I see this as one funder commits, others will come. And so being committed to EFOD and sharing this framework within your own ecosystems, that some of us that are not privy to sort of those wealth ecosystems is part of that. I think that's like a starting point. So get in touch with us. We can talk more about that. I think around the investment, that's an excellent question, and I can ramble for that for a long time. I think one of the things that we're hoping to share with you guys in the coming months is really a case for the fact that, I mean, and I'll share this personally because I don't want to speak for everybody here. You know, the money that's often deployed in investment vehicles is not yours to begin with, right? At some point, that money was extracted for the very neighborhoods that we here are representing. So part of the framework that we really have to think about is, how do you as investors think about return on investment differently, right? And so that means that when you deploy capital, one, you're not, you know, maybe you're not looking to make a return at all. And a return, I mean a financial return, and that you can start building that consciousness in your own ecosystems around what a return on investment could look like, right? Like, what is that social capital that you're building? How do you rethink what that ROI piece is? So, you know, I 100% agree. I mean, I think what we talked about very lightly in those recommendations was that the first piece that we need investment in is it's not debt, it's not loan capital. It's really investment in allowing us as community leaders to build that asset base, to organize, to do that community building work that allows us then to think through about market interventions or whatever those other things might be. So yeah, and then I think maybe something that we're also looking to think through, an invitation would be, is that if the EFOD framework resonates with you, and knowing that at some point within an EFOD project, there is needs for capital and there is that capacity to return some of that capital, is to help us think through how we can support you in changing some of those institutional mechanisms that don't allow us to access capital to begin with, right? And, you know, we didn't talk about explicitly about the racial wealth gap, or how those like 5 C's of credit are a way that continue to marginalize folks. But I think part of that is for us to think about that thought partnership and how do we help you change those systems? Because as we can get to in the case studies, and we can share with you more down the road, part of our challenges is that if we scrap together investment, or if we scrap together philanthropic funds to do that community-based building, and we come up with a project that's going to really build wealth, that's going to be sustainable, it's going to be owned by community, we then run to the next barrier, which is, how do we finance these things, right? How do we finance these things in neighborhoods with folks who may not have collateral, that don't have that tangible asset base that banks look to as a risk mitigation strategy. So I think that there's a lot to unpack there, but I would also invite you to think about, like, why should we pay you this money back? Period.
Yep.
Great.
Amen to all that. Yeah.
Do you want to add anything, Neelam?
I mean, all of that, you know, I think maybe I also want to just take a moment to say that, you know, there are some funders and philanthropists who do get it, right? That's why we are kind of, and I just want to acknowledge that, that's why we are where we are, and we've been able to kind of build some models. But we need a lot more of that. And it isn't just, I wouldn't say, it's not just in the lending world that it's kind of like, well, where did that money come from? But, you know, one of my original quotes for this webinar was going to be actually from Mumia Abu Jamal about the nonprofit industrial complex. You know, you chase any money to its root, where has that money come from? Ultimately, it's been extracted from somewhere, right? You know, so that money being put back to the good of building real long-term sustainable economic solutions in communities that we work in, I think we just have to really change the way that we all are looking at this picture, right? Because, you know, it's not just about my project here or Mariela's project in Oakland or Lorena's, you know, it's about like the sort of where we're in right now is a crisis for humanity, right? So it's kind of like we can either think about short-term comeback on our money, short-term solutions to things, or we can really seriously start to think about how everything that we do has an impact on the long-term sustainability of the planet and of humanity, right? And that starts with projects like this, you know? So first of all, acknowledging that there are people out there who get it, and that it isn't just about sort of, you know, about naysaying any of that historical work. For example, actually, one thing I wanted to mention is, you know, Trisha didn't just come out of nowhere and fall into DAISA. Trisha was working with Mandela Partners for many years, right? And was actually at that initial meeting that I referenced earlier in the history section, right? And so there are many ways in which getting to this point has been supported. And it isn't just in the direct financing of economic food-related projects, but also in the kind of telling of our stories, in the creating of fellowships that allows us to investigate and look at the cultural aspects of our work, that allows us to really start beginning to tell the story in the way we want to tell it, which is in a very, very holistic manner, right? And so this is why we've refrained from connecting this collaborative with any one funder or any one philanthropist, because we want everyone who's out there who sees the importance of doing this work to be invited in and to be wanting to come in and to help to build this.
That's great. So I just want to allow each of you maybe 30 seconds to a minute to just close us out with your final words that you want to leave people with. And if you don't want to, you can decline.
Well, I think, well, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining the webinar, and also, you know, like, for example, we're out here on the border, and sometimes it can be very isolating from the rest of the community of El Paso, and of course the rest of the country. And it's kind of hard to get our voice out there about what we're struggling for and what we're struggling against. Try to put our kind of ways of seeing, ways of organizing out there. So I do welcome the opportunity to be able to speak to more organizations, to speak to other people who are doing this kind of work, just to nurture our practice as well, to learn from everybody. And so, you know, I'm really grateful that so many people were interested in coming to this talk, and hopefully they'll also be able to join in this conversation and to participate in growing EFOD and developing what that looks like. And so we're just really grateful to be part of this, and to not, you know, to get our way of seeing and organizing. And also there are some funders and others that, you know, when that money allows us to be creative, it really helps us push our organizing and our ways of thoughts and our implementation forward. And so if all together we could push for more of those types of resources, and that would be, that would be a great accomplishment, I think, for all of our communities or for all of our organizations that are building communities. So just thank you to everybody who came in to listen in.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, read the white paper, please help distribute the white paper, get the word out on it, and get involved in the way that makes sense for you and in the way that you can. And not just yourself, but if you know of other organizations, folks doing work who should be connected to the network who are not, please connect them. There's a lot of work ahead of us. This is only just skimming the surface. We've got a lot to do, and the more folks who will get involved, the better to build this.
Yeah, I'll just echoing what folks have already said. I'm super grateful that all of you who came to listen to us talk about this framework. I think, I remember when, Neelam and Dana were starting these conversations, having a feeling of how will this be received, right? Like, we know intrinsically what our work looks like and the importance of it, but how will it be received to a broader audience of folks? So just to extend that, I'm really grateful for the questions that you all asked about, from your own sectors, philanthropy, investment, agriculture, of how you can be involved. I think that there are definitely ways for you to continue to be involved. And I would just leave you with the call to action to really think about the work that we're all leading as the way that we think about it, right? Is that we're not looking at what's missing, we're looking at what is and what exists in our communities, and how do we get the right kinds of investment. And investment, I mean philanthropy, and yes, impact investment, whatever that might be. But I also just mean investment in the sense of capacity building and technical expertise, your time, your thoughtfulness, like anything that you can bring to the table to help us ensure that this asset framework, this community power framework, continues to grow and build and thrive is helpful, appreciated, and acknowledged. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, guys. And I'd just like to give a few points in the outro. Again, people asked about, how can I share this? How can I watch this webinar again? And you will get a link within 24 hours. You can also go to ngfn.org/webinars and find it there. I also wanted to just really thank the fellows and to Trisha as well for allowing us to be a part of this. We also have our Food Systems Leadership Network, which is an opportunity for some of you watching this webinar to join in a community of practice with others, whether they are staff and nonprofits, but leaders who are working on the food system. And you can learn more about that at wallacecenter.org/FSLN. And lastly, we have a conference coming up, and it's going to be awesome, and it's in New Orleans, and everyone loves New Orleans. So we want to encourage you guys to come out. We have a little save the date here. It's in March 10th through the 13th. And the Wallace Center, we are really going through a phase of reflection and transformation as an organization. I'm one of the newest staff members, and I'm really enjoying seeing what we're trying to do, the hard look that we're taking at ourselves as an organization as we try and move forward. And we're inviting folks to come to this conference to do the same with us, to look at what has been done in the past, but also to build on how we're going to collaborate together in the future. So our theme for this conference is A More Just Vision, collaborating on the future of good food. Again, that's going to be in New Orleans. I believe that the fellows will be there, and so if you want to maybe see them in person, that's another way that you could do that, is to come in New Orleans and join us. And lastly, ngfn.org is a place where you can find many resources. We have over 80 webinars that give really valuable content, such as this one today, and you'll also be able to find this one again. So lastly, just thank you again. Not featured here is Jeff Farbman. He's our Senior Program Associate. He helps us with all things webinar, and just want to give him a shout out for helping us make this look as good as it did today. So with that, I will close us out and just say thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.